My brother Wilfred keeps saying that it's not fair that it should all have happened to me. Me being a girl and a baby and too stupid to lace up my own sandals properly. But I think it's fair. I think everything happened exactly the way it should have done, except for the sad parts. And maybe those too. I'm Suze, and I am 9 years old. 10 next month, on the anniversary of the day the griffin came. Wilfred says it was because of me that the griffin heard that the ugliest baby in the world had just been born, and it was going to eat me, but I was too ugly even for a griffin, so it nested in the midwood. We call it that, but its real name is the midnight wood, because of the darkness under the trees. And it stayed to eat our sheep and our goats. Griffins do that if they like a place. But it didn't ever eat children. Not until this year. I only saw it once. I mean, once before. Rising up before the trees one night like a second moon. Only there wasn't a moon then. There was nothing in the whole world but the griffin, golden feathers all blazing on its lion's body and eagle's wings, with its great front claws like teeth, and that monstrous beak that looked so huge for its head. Wilfred says I screamed for 3 days, but he's lying. And I didn't hide in the root cellar like he says either. I slept in the barn those 2 nights with our dog Malka, because I knew Malka wouldn't let anything get me. I mean, my parents wouldn't have either, not if they could have stopped it. It's just that Malka is the biggest, fiercest dog in the whole village, and she's not afraid of anything. And after the griffin took Jaheen, the blacksmith's little girl, you couldn't help seeing how frightened my father was, running back and forth with the other men, trying to organize some sort of patrol so people could always tell when the griffin was coming. I know he was frightened for me, and my mother, and doing everything he could to protect us. But it didn't make me feel any safer, and Malka did. But nobody knew what to do anyway. Not my father, nobody. It was bad enough when the griffin was only taking the sheep, because almost everyone here sells wool or cheese or sheepskin things to make a living. But once it took Jane, early last spring, that changed everything. We sent messengers to the king, 3 of them, and each time the king sent someone back to us with them. The first time it was one night all by himself. His name was Duros, and he gave me an apple. He rode away into the midwood, singing to look for the griffin, and we never saw him again. The second time, after the griffin took Luli, the boy who worked for the miller, the king sent 5 knights together, and one of them did come back, but he died before he could tell anyone what happened. The third time, an entire squadron came. That's what my father said, anyway. I don't know how many soldiers there are in a squadron, but it was a lot. And they were all over the village for 2 days, pitching their tents everywhere, stabling their horses in every barn, and boasting in the tavern how they'd soon take care of that griffin for us poor peasants. They had musicians playing when they marched into the midwood. I remember that. And I remember when the music stopped, and the sounds we heard afterward. After that, the village didn't send to the king anymore. We didn't want more of his men to die. And besides, they weren't any help. So from then on, all the children were hurried indoors when the sun went down, and the griffin woke from its day's rest to hunt again. We couldn't play together, or run errands, or watch the flocks for our parents, or even sleep near open windows for fear of the griffin. There was nothing for me to do but read books I already knew by heart, and complain to my mother and father, who were too tired from watching after Wilfred and me to bother with us. They were guarding the other children too, turn and turn about with the other families, and our sheep, and our goats. So they were always tired, as well as frightened. And we were all angry with each other the most of the time, and it was the same for everybody. And then the griffin took Felicitas. Felicitas couldn't talk, but she was my best friend, always, since we were little. I always understood what she wanted to say, and she understood me better than anyone, and we played in a special way that I won't ever play with anyone else. Her family thought she was a waste of food, because no boy would marry a dumb girl, so they let her eat with us most of the time. Wilfred used to make fun of the whispery quack that was the one sound she could make, but I hit him with a rock, and after that he didn't do it anymore. I didn't see it happen, but I still see it in my head. She knew not to go out, but she was always just so happy coming to us in the evening. And nobody at her house would have noticed her being gone. None of them ever noticed Felicitas. The day I learned Felicitas was gone, that was the day I set off to see the king myself. Well, the same night, actually, because there wasn't any chance of getting away from my house or the village in daylight. I don't know what I'd have done, really, except that my Uncle Ambrose was carting a load of sheepskins to market in Hagsgate, and you have to start long before sunup to be there by the time that the market opens. And Uncle Ambrose is my best uncle. But I know I could not ask him to take me to the king. He'd have gone straight to my mother instead, and told her to give me sulphur and molasses and put me to bed with a mustard plaster. He gives his horse sulphur and molasses even. So I went to bed early that night, and I waited until everyone was asleep. I wanted to leave a note on my pillow, but I kept writing things and then tearing the notes up and throwing them in the fireplace, and I was afraid of somebody waking, or Uncle Ambrose leaving without me. So finally I just wrote, "I will come home soon." I didn't take any clothes with me, or anything else, except a bit of cheese, because I thought, well, the king must live somewhere near Hagsgate, which is the only big town I've ever seen. My mother and father were snoring in their room, but Wilfred had fallen asleep right in front of the hearth, and they always leave him there when he does. If you rouse him to go to his own bed, he comes up fighting and crying. I don't know why. Well, I stood and looked down at him for the longest time. Wilfred doesn't look nearly so mean when he's sleeping. My mother had banked the coals to make sure there'd be a fire for tomorrow's bread, and my father's moleskin intrudes were hanging there to dry because he'd had to wade into the stock pond that afternoon to rescue a lamb. I moved them a little bit so they wouldn't burn. I wound the clock. Wilfred's supposed to do that every night, but he always forgets. And I thought how they'd all hear it ticking in the morning while they were looking everywhere for me, too frightened to eat my breakfast. And I turned to go back to my room. But then I turned around again, and I climbed out of the kitchen window, because our front door squeaks so. I was afraid that Malka might wake in the barn, and right away know I was up to something, because I can't ever fool Malka. Only she didn't. And then I held my breath almost the whole way as I ran to Uncle Ambrose's house and scrambled right into his cart with the sheepskins. It was a cold night, but under that pile of sheepskins it was hot and nasty smelling, and there wasn't anything to do but lie still and wait for Uncle Ambrose. So I mostly thought about Felicitas, to keep from feeling so bad about leaving home and everyone. That was bad enough. I never really lost anybody close before. Not forever. But anyway, it was different. I don't know when Uncle Ambrose finally came, because I dozed off in the cart and didn't wake until there was this jolt and a rattle, and the sort of floppy grumble a horse makes when he's been waked up and doesn't like it. And then we were off for Hagsgate. The half moon was setting early, but I could see the village bumping by, not looking silvery in the light, but small and dull, no color to anything. And all the same, I almost began to cry, because it already seemed so far away, although we hadn't even passed the stock pond yet, and I felt as though I'd never see it again. I would have climbed back out of the cart right then if I hadn't known better, because the griffin was still up and hunting. I couldn't see it, of course, under the sheepskins, and I had my eyes shut anyway. But its wings made a sound, like a lot of knives being sharpened all together. And sometimes it gave a cry that was dreadful because it was so soft and gentle, and even a little sad and scared, as though it were imitating the sound Felicitas might have made when it took her. I burrowed deep down as I could and tried to sleep again, but I couldn't, which was just as well, because I didn't want to ride all the way to Hagsgate, where Uncle Ambrose was bound to find me when he unloaded sheepskins at the marketplace. So when I didn't hear the griffin anymore, they won't hunt far from their nests if they don't have to, I put my head out over the tailboard of the cart and watched the stars going out, one by one, as the sky grew lighter. The dawn breeze came up as the moon went down. When the cart stopped jouncing and shaking so much, I knew we must have turned into the King's Highway. And when I could hear cows munching and talking softly to each other, I dropped into the road. I stood there for a little, brushing off lint and wool bits, and watching Uncle Ambrose's cart rolling on away from me. I hadn't ever been this far from home by myself, or so lonely. The breeze brushed dry grass against my ankles, and I didn't have any idea which way to go. I didn't even know the king's name. I'd never heard anyone call him anything but the king. I knew he didn't live in Hagsgate, but in a big castle somewhere nearby. Only, nearby is one thing when you're riding in a cart, and different when you're walking. And I kept thinking about my family waking up and looking for me, and the cows' grazing sounds made me hungry, and I'd eaten all my cheese in the cart. I wished I had a penny with me, not to buy anything with, but only to toss up and let it tell me if I should turn left or right. I tried it with flat stones, but I never could find them after they came down. Finally, I started off going left, not for any reason, but only because I have a little silver ring on my left hand that my mother gave me. There was a sort of path that way too, and I thought maybe I could walk around Hagsgate, and then I'd think about what to do after that. I'm a good walker. I can walk anywhere if you give me time. Only it's easier on a real road. The path gave out after a while, and I had to push my way through trees growing too close together. And then through so many brambly vines, my hair was full of stickers and my arms were all stinging and bleeding. I was tired and sweating and almost crying. Almost. Whenever I sat down to rest, bugs and things kept crawling over me. And then I heard running water nearby, and that made me thirsty right away, so I tried to get down to the sound. I had to crawl most of the way, scratching my knees and elbows up, something awful. It wasn't much of a stream. In some places the water came up barely above my ankles. But I was so glad to see it, I practically hugged and kissed it, flopping down with my face buried in it, the way I do with Malka's smelly old fur. And I drank until I couldn't hold any more. And then I sat on a stone and let the tiny fish tickle my nice cold feet, and felt the sun on my shoulders. And I didn't think about griffins, or kings, or my family, or anything. I only looked up when I heard the horses whickering a little way upstream. They were playing with the water, the way horses do, blowing bubbles like children. Plain, old livery stable horses, one brownish, one grayish. The gray's rider was out of the saddle, peering at the horse's left forefoot. I couldn't get a good look. They both had on plain cloaks, dark green, and trews so worn you couldn't make out the color, so I didn't know that one was a woman until I heard her voice. A nice voice, low, like Silky Joan, the lady that my mother won't ever let me ask about, but with something rough in it too, as though she could scream like a hawk if she really wanted to. She was saying, "There's no stone I can see, maybe a thorn?" And the other rider, the one on the brown horse, answered her, "Or a bruise, let me see." That voice was lighter and younger sounding than the woman's voice, but I already knew he was a man because he was so tall. He got down off the brown horse, and the woman moved aside to let him pick up her horse's foot. Before he did that, he put his hands on the horse's head, one on each side, and he said something to it that I couldn't quite hear. And the horse said something back. Not like a neigh, or a whinny, or any of the sounds that horses make, but like one person talking to another. I can't say it any better than that. The tall man bent down then, and he took hold of the foot, and he looked at it for a long time. And the horse didn't move or switch its tail or anything. A stone splinter, the man said after a while. It's very small, but it's worked itself deep into the hoof, and there's an ulcer brewing. I can't think why I didn't notice it straight away. Well, the woman said, and she touched his shoulder, you can't notice everything. The tall man seemed angry with himself, the way my father gets when he's forgotten to close the pasture gate properly, and our neighbor's black ram gets in and fights with our poor old Brimstone. He said, I can. I am supposed to. And then he turned his back to the horse and bent over that forefoot, the way our blacksmith does, and he went to work on it. I couldn't see what he was doing exactly, not exactly. He didn't have any picks or priors like the blacksmith, and all I'm sure of is that I think he was singing to the horse, but I'm not sure it was proper singing. It sounded more like the little made-up rhymes that really small children chant to themselves when they're playing in the dirt all alone. No tune, just up and down. Dee-da, dee-da, dee. Boring even for a horse, I'd have thought. He kept doing it for a long time, still bending with that hoof in his hand. All at once, he stopped singing and stood up, holding something that glinted in the sun the way the stream did, and he showed it to the horse first thing. There, he said. There, that's what it was. It's all right now. And he tossed the thing away and picked up the hoof again, not singing, only touching it very lightly with one finger, brushing across it again and again. And then he set the foot down, and the horse stamped once, hard, and whinnied. And the tall man turned to the woman and said, You ought to camp here for the night all the same. They're both weary, and my back hurts. The woman laughed, a deep, sweet, slow sound it was. I'd never heard a laugh like that. She said, The greatest wizard walking the world, and your back hurts? Heal it as you healed mine, the time the tree fell on me. That took you all of 5 minutes, I believe. Oh, longer than that, the man answered her. You were delirious. You wouldn't remember. He touched her hair, which was thick and pretty, even though it was mostly gray. You know how I am about that, he said. I still like being mortal too much to use magic on myself. It spoils it somehow. It dulls the feeling. I've told you before. The woman said, the way I've heard my mother say it 1,000 times. Well, I've been mortal all my life, and some days... She didn't finish what she was saying, and the tall man smiled, the way you could tell he was teasing her. Some days what? Nothing, the woman said. Nothing, nothing. She sounded irritable for a moment, but she put her hands on the man's arms, and she said in a different voice, Some days, some early mornings, when the wind smells of blossoms I will never see, and there are fawns playing in the misty orchards, and you are yawning and mumbling and scratching your head and growling that we'll see rain before nightfall, and probably hail as well. On such mornings, I wish with all my heart that we could both live forever, and I think you were a great fool to give it up. And she laughed again, but it sounded shaky now a little. And she said, Then I remember things I would rather not remember. So then my stomach acts up, and all sorts of other things start twinging me. And never mind what they are, or where they hurt, whether it's my body, or my head, or my heart. And then I think, no, I suppose not. Maybe not. And the tall man put his arms around her, and for a moment she rested her head on his chest. I couldn't hear what she said after that. I didn't think I had made any noise, but the man raised his voice a little, not looking at me, not lifting his head. And he said, Child, there's food here. First I couldn't move, I was so frightened. He couldn't have seen me through the brush and all the alder trees. And then I started remembering how hungry I was. And I started toward them without knowing I was doing it. I actually looked down at my feet and watched them moving like somebody else's feet, as though they were the hungry ones. Only they had to have me take them to the food. The man and the woman stood very still and waited for me. Close to, the woman looked younger than her voice, and the tall man looked older. No, well, that wasn't it. That's not what I mean. She wasn't young at all, but the gray hair made her face younger. And she held herself regally straight, really straight, like the lady who comes when people in our village are having babies. She holds her face all stiff too, that one, and I don't like her much. This woman's face wasn't beautiful, I suppose, but it was a face that you would want to snuggle up to on a cold night. That's the best I know how to say it. The man, well, one minute he looked younger than my father, and the next he'd be looking older than anybody I ever saw, older than people are supposed to be, maybe. He didn't have any gray hair himself, but he did have a lot of lines. But that's not what I'm talking about either. It was the eyes. His eyes were green, green, green. Not like grass, not like emeralds. I saw an emerald once. A gypsy woman showed me. And not anything like apples or limes or such stuff. Maybe like the ocean. Except I've never seen the ocean, so I don't know. If you go deep enough into the woods, not the midwood, of course, but any other sort of woods, sooner or later, you'll always come to a place where even the shadows are green. And that's the way his eyes were. I was afraid of his eyes at first. The woman gave me a peach and watched me bite into it, too hungry to thank her. She asked me, "Girl, what are you doing here? Are you lost?" "No, I'm not," I replied with my mouth full. "I just don't know where I am. That's different." And they both laughed. But it wasn't a mean, making fun laugh. I told them, "My name's Suze, and I have to see the king. He lives somewhere right nearby, doesn't he?" And they looked at each other. I couldn't tell what they were thinking, but the tall man raised his eyebrows. The woman shook her head a bit, slowly. They looked at each other for a long time, until the woman said, "Well, not nearby, but not so very far either. We were bound on our way to visit him ourselves." "Good," I said. "Oh, good." I was trying to sound as grown-up as they were, but it was hard, because I was so happy to find out that they could take me to the king. So I said, "I'll go along with you then." The woman was against it before I got the first words out. She said to the tall man, "No, we couldn't. We don't know how things are." And she looked sad about it. But she looked firm, too. She said, "Girl, it's not you worries me. The king is a good man and an old friend. But it has been a long time, and kings change. Even more than other people, kings change." "I have to see him," I said. "You go on then. I'm not going home until I see him." I finished the peach, and the man handed me a chunk of dried fish and smiled at the woman as I tore into it. He said quietly to her, "It seems to me that you and I both remember asking to be taken along on a quest. I can't speak for you, but I begged." But the woman wouldn't let up. "We could be bringing her into great peril. You can't take the chance. It isn't right." And he began to answer her, but I interrupted. My mother would have slapped me halfway across the kitchen. I shouted at them, "I'm coming from great peril. There is a griffin nested in the midwood, and he's eaten Jan and Lily and my friend Felicitas." And then I did start weeping, and I didn't care. I just stood there and shook and wailed and dropped the dried fish. I tried to pick it up, still crying so hard I couldn't even see it. But the woman stopped me and gave me her scarf to dry my eyes and blow my nose. It smelled nice. "Child," the tall man kept saying, "child, don't take on so. We didn't know about the griffin." And the woman was holding me against her side, smoothing my hair and glaring at him as though it was his fault that I was howling like that. She said, "Of course we'll take you with us, dear girl." "There, never mind. Of course we will. That's a fearful matter, a griffin. But the king will know what to do about it. The king Eats griffins for breakfast snacks. Spreads them on toast with orange marmalade and gobbles them up, I promise you. And so on, being silly, but making me feel better, while the man went on pleading with me not to cry. I finally stopped when he pulled a big red handkerchief out of his pocket, twisted and knotted it into a bird shape, and made it fly away. Uncle Ambrose does tricks with coins and shells, but he can't do anything like that. His name was Schmendrick, which I still think is the funniest name I've heard in my life. The woman's name was Molly Grew. We didn't leave right away, because of the horses, but we made camp where we were instead. I was waiting for the man, Schmendrick, to do it by magic, but he only built a fire and set out their blankets and drew water from the stream like anybody else, while she hobbled the horses and put them to graze. I gathered firewood. The woman, Molly, told me that the king's name was Lear, and that they had known him when he was a very young man, before he became king. He is a true hero, she said, a dragon slayer, a giant killer, a rescuer of maidens, a solver of impossible riddles. He may be the greatest hero of all, because he is a good man as well, and they aren't always. But you didn't want me to meet him, I said. Why was that? Molly sighed. We were sitting under a tree, watching the sun go down, and she was brushing things out of my hair, and she said, "He's old now. Schmendrick has trouble with time. I'll tell you why one day. It is a long story. And he doesn't understand that Lear may no longer be the man he was. It could be a sad reunion." She started braiding my hair around my head so it wouldn't get in the way. I've had an unhappy feeling about this journey from the beginning, Suze. But he took a notion that Lear needed us, so here we are. You can't argue with him when he gets like that. A good wife isn't supposed to argue with her husband, I said. My mother says you wait until he goes out or he's asleep, and then you just do whatever you want. Molly laughed, that rich, funny sound of hers, like a kind of a deep gurgle. Suze, I've only known you a few hours, but I would bet every penny I've got right now, I and all of Schmendrick's too, that you'll be arguing on your wedding night with whoever you marry. Anyway, Schmendrick and I aren't married. We're together, that's all. We've been together quite a long while. Oh, I said. I didn't know any people who were together like that. Not the way she said it. Well, you look married. You sort of do. Molly's face didn't change, but she put an arm around my shoulders and hugged me close for a moment, and she whispered in my ear, I wouldn't marry him if he were the last man in the world. He eats wild radishes in bed. Crunch, 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 all night. Crunch, crunch, crunch. And I giggled, and the tall man looked over at us from where he was washing a pan in the stream. The last of the sunlight was on him, and those green eyes were bright as new leaves, and one of them winked at me, and I felt it, the way you feel a tiny breeze on your skin when it's hot. And then he went back to scrubbing the pan. Will it take us long to reach the king? I asked her. You said he didn't live too far. I'm scared the griffin will eat somebody else while I am gone. I need to be home. Molly finished with my hair and gave it a gentle tug to bring my head up, and it made me look straight into her eyes. They were as gray as Schmendrick's were green, and I already knew that they turned darker or lighter gray depending on her mood. And what do you expect to happen when you meet King Lear, Suze? She asked me right back. What did you have in mind when you set off to find him? I was surprised. Well, I'm going to get him to come back to my village with me. All those knights he keeps sending aren't doing any good at all, so he'll just have to take care of that griffin himself. He's the king. It's his job. Yes, Molly said, but she said it so softly I could barely hear her. She patted my arm once, lightly, then she got up and walked away to sit by herself near the fire. She made it look as though she was banking the fire, but she wasn't really. We started out early the next morning. Molly had me in front of her, on her horse, for a time. But by and by, Schmendrick took me up on his, to spare the other one's sore foot. He was more comfortable to lean against than I'd expected, and bony in some places, but nice and springy in others. He didn't talk much, but he sang a lot as we went along, sometimes in languages I couldn't make out a word of, sometimes making up silly songs to make me laugh, like this one. Susley, Susley, speaking loosely, you disturb my oozly goosely. Susley, Susley, would you choosely to become my squoozly squoozily? He didn't do anything magic, except maybe once, when a crow kept diving at the horse. Out of meanness, that's all. There wasn't a nest anywhere. And making the poor thing dance and shy and skitter until I almost fell off. And Schmendrick finally turned in the saddle and looked at it. And the next minute a hawk came swooping out of nowhere and chased that crow screaming into a thorn bush, where the hawk couldn't follow. I guess that was magic. It was actually pretty country we were passing through, once we got onto the proper road. Trees, meadows, little soft valleys, hillsides covered with wildflowers I didn't know. You could see they got a lot more rain here than we do where I live. It's a good thing sheep don't need grazing, the way cows do. They'll go where the goats go, and goats will go anywhere. We're like that in my village. We have to be. But I liked this land better. Schmendrick told me it hadn't always been like that. Before Lear, this was all barren desert where nothing grew. Nothing, Suze. It was said that the country was under a curse, and in a way it was. But I'll tell you about that another time. People always say that when you're a child, and I hate it. But Lear changed everything. The land was so glad to see him that it began blooming and blossoming the moment he became king, and it has done so ever since. Well, except poor Hagsgate, but that's another story too. And his voice got slower and deeper when he talked about Hagsgate, as though he weren't talking to me. I twisted my neck around to look up at him. Do you think King Lear will come back with me and kill the griffin? I think Molly thinks he won't because he's so old. I hadn't known I was worried about that until I actually said it. Why, of course he will, girl. Schmendrick winked at me again. He never could resist the plea of a maiden in distress. The more difficult and dangerous the deed, the better. If he did not spur to your village's aid himself at the first call, it was surely because he was engaged in some other heroic venture. I'm as certain as I can be that as soon as you make your request, remember to curtsy properly. He will snatch up his great sword and spear, whisk you up to his saddlebow, and be off after your griffin with the road smoking behind him. Young or old, that has always been his way. And he rumpled my hair in the back. Molly over-worries. That's her way. We are who we are. What's a curtsy? I asked him. I mean, I know now, because Molly showed me, but I didn't then. He didn't laugh except with his eyes, and then he gestured for me to face forward again as he went back to singing. Susley, Susley, you amuse me right down to my solusty shoesly, Susley, Susley, I bring newsly, we could wed next Tuesday, Tuesday. I learned that the king had lived in a castle on a cliff by the sea when he was young, less than a day's journey from Hagsgate, but it fell down. Schmendrick wouldn't tell me how, so he built a new one somewhere else. I was sorry about that, because I've never been to see the sea, and I've always wanted to, and I still haven't. But I'd never seen a castle either, so there was that. I leaned back against his chest and fell asleep. They'd been traveling slowly, taking time to let Molly's horse heal, but once its hoof was all right, we galloped most of the rest of the way. Those horses of theirs didn't look magic or special, but they could run for hours without getting tired, and when I helped to rub them down and curry them, they were hardly sweating. They slept on their sides like people, not standing up, the way our horses do. And even so, it took us 3 full days to reach King Lear. Molly said he had bad memories of the castle that fell down, so that was why this one was so far from the sea as he could make it, and is different from the old one. It was on a hill, so the king could see anyone coming along the road, but there wasn't a moat, and there weren't any guards in armor. And there was only one banner on the walls. It was blue, with a picture of a white unicorn on it, and nothing else. I was disappointed. I tried not to show it, but Molly saw. "You wanted a fortress," she said to me gently. "You were expecting dark stone towers, flags and cannons and knights, trumpeters blowing from the battlements. I'm sorry, it being your first castle and all." "No, it's a pretty castle," I said. And it was pretty, sitting peacefully on its hilltop in the sunlight, surrounded by all those wildflowers. There was a marketplace I could see now, and there were huts, like ours, snugged up against the castle walls, so that people could come inside for protection if they needed to. I said, "Just looking at it, you can see that the king is a nice man." Molly was looking at me with her head a little bit to one side. She said, "Oh, he is a hero, Suze. Remember that. Whatever else you see, whatever you think, Lear is a hero." "Well, I know that," I said. "I'm sure he'll help me. I am." But I wasn't. The moment I saw that nice friendly castle, I wasn't a bit sure. We didn't have any trouble getting in. The gate simply opened when Schmendrick knocked once, and he and Molly and I walked in through the market, where people were selling all kinds of fruits and vegetables, pots and pans and clothing and so on, the way they do in our village. And they all called to us to come over to their barracks and buy things. But nobody tried to stop us going through to the castle. There were two men at the two great doors, and they did ask us our names and why we wanted to see King Lear. And the moment Schmendrick told them his name, they stepped back quickly and let us by. So I began to think that maybe he actually was a great magician, even if I never saw him do anything but little tricks and little songs. The men didn't offer to take him to the king, and he didn't ask. Molly was right. I was expecting the castle to be all cold and shadowy, with queens looking sideways at us and big men clanking by in armor. But the halls we followed Schmendrick through were full of sunlight from long high windows. And the people we saw were mostly, they just nodded and smiled at us. We passed a stone stair curling up out of sight, and I was sure that the king must live at the top. But Schmendrick never looked at it. He led us straight through the great hall. They had a fireplace big enough to roast 3 cows, and on past the kitchens, and the scullery, and the laundry, to a room under another stair. That was dark. You wouldn't have found it unless you knew where to look. Schmendrick didn't knock at that door, and he didn't say anything magic to make it open. He just stood outside and waited, and by and by it rattled open, and we went in. The king was in there. All by himself, the king was in there. He was sitting on an ordinary wooden chair, not a throne. It was a really small room, the same size as my mother's weaving room, so maybe that's why he looked so big. He was as tall as Schmendrick, but he seemed so much wider. I was ready for him to have a long beard spreading out all across his chest, but he only had a short one, like my father, except white. He wore a red and gold mantle, and there was a real golden crown on his white head, not much bigger than the wreaths that we put on our champion rams at the end of the year. He had a kind face, with a big old nose, and big blue eyes like a little boy. But his eyes were so tired and heavy, I didn't know how he kept them open. Sometimes he didn't. There was nobody else in the little room, and he peered at the 3 of us as though he knew us, but not why. He tried to smile. Schmendrick said very gently, "Majesty, it is Schmendrick and Molly. Molly grew." And the king blinked at him. "Molly with the cat," Molly whispered. "You remember the cat, Lear?" "Yes," the king said. It seemed to take him forever to speak that one word. "The cat. Yes, of course." But he didn't say anything after that, and we stood there and stood there. And the king kept smiling at something I couldn't see. Schmendrick said to Molly, "She used to forget herself like that." His voice had changed, the same way it changed when he was talking about the way the land used to be. He said, "And then you would always remind her that she was a unicorn." And the king changed too, then. All at once his eyes were clear and shining with feeling, like Molly's eyes, and he saw us for the first time, and he said softly, "Oh, my friends." And he stood up and came to us and put his arms around Schmendrick and Molly, and I saw that he had been a hero, and that he was still a hero, and I began to think it might be all right after all. Maybe it was really going to be all right. "And who may this princess be?" he asked, looking straight at me. He had the proper voice for a king, deep and strong, but not frightening, not mean. I tried to tell him my name, but I couldn't make a sound. So he actually knelt on one knee in front of me, and he took my hand, and he said, "I have often been of some use to princesses in distress. Command me." "I'm not a princess. I'm Sue's," I said. "And I'm from a village you wouldn't even know. And there's a griffin eating the children." And it all tumbled out like that, in one big breath. But he didn't laugh or look at me any differently. What he did was ask me the name of my village. And I told him. And he said, "But indeed, I know it, madam. I have been there. And now I will have the pleasure of returning." Over his shoulder I saw Schmendrick and Molly staring at each other. Schmendrick was about to say something, but then they both turned toward the door, because a small, dark woman, about my mother's age, only dressed in tunic, trews, and boots like Molly, had just come in. She said, in a small, worried voice, "I am so truly sorry that I was not here to greet His Majesty's old companions. No need to tell me your illustrious names. My own is Lysaine, and I am the King's royal secretary, translator, and protector." And she took King Lear's arm very politely and carefully, and began moving him back to his chair. Schmendrick seemed to take a minute, getting his own breath back. He said, "I have never known my old friend Lear to need any of those services, especially a protector." Lysaine was very busy with the king and did not look at Schmendrick as she answered him, "How long has it been since you saw him last?" Schmendrick didn't answer. Lysaine's voice was quiet still, but not so nervous. "Time sets its claws in us all, my lord, sooner or later. We are none of us that which we were." And King Lear sat down obediently on his chair and closed his eyes. I could tell that Schmendrick was angry, and growing angrier as he stood there, but he didn't show it. My father gets angry like that, which is how I knew. He said, "His Majesty agreed to return to this young person's village with her in order to rid her people of a marauding griffin. We will start out tomorrow." Lysaine swung round on us so fast that I was sure she was going to start shouting and giving everybody orders. But she didn't do anything like that. You could never have told me that she was the least bit annoyed or alarmed. All she said was, "I am afraid that will not be possible, my lord. The king is in no fit condition for such a journey, nor certainly for such a deed." "The king thinks rather differently." Schmendrick was talking through clenched teeth now. "Does he, then?" Lysaine pointed at King Lear, and I saw that he had fallen asleep in his chair. His head was drooping. I was afraid his crown was going to fall off, and his mouth hung open. Lysaine said, "You came, seeking the peerless warrior you remember, and you have found a spent, senile old man. Believe me, I understand your distress, but you must see—" Schmendrick cut her off. I never understood what people meant when they talked about someone's eyes actually flashing, but at least green eyes can do it. He looked even taller than he was, and when he pointed a finger at Lysaine, I honestly expected the little woman to catch fire, or maybe melt away. Schmendrick's voice was especially frightening because it was so quiet. He said, Hear me now. I am Schmendrick the magician, and I see my old friend Lear as I have always seen him, wise and powerful and good, beloved of a unicorn. And with that word, for a second time the king woke up. He blinked once, and then gripped the arms of the chair and pushed himself to his feet. He didn't look at us, but at Lysen, and he said, I will go with them. It is my task and my gift. You will see to it that I am made ready. Lysen said, No, Majesty, no. Majesty, I beg you. But King Lear reached out and took Lysen's head between his big hands, and I saw that there was love between them. And he said, It is what I am for. You know that as well as he does. See to it, Lysen, and keep all well for me while I am gone. Lysen looked so sad, so lost, that I didn't know what to think about her or King Lear or anything. I didn't realize that I had moved back against Molly Grew until I felt her hand in my hair. She didn't say anything, but it was nice smelling her there. Lysen said very quietly, I will see to it. And she turned around then and started for the door with her head lowered. I think she wanted to pass us by without looking at us at all, but she couldn't do it. Right at the door, her head came up, and she stared at Schmendrick so hard that I pushed into Molly's skirt so I couldn't see her eyes. I heard her say, as though she could barely make out the words come out, His death be on your head, magician. I think she was crying, only not the way grown people do. And I heard Schmendrick's answer, and his voice was so cold I would not have recognized it if I didn't know. He has died before. Better that death, better this, better any death, than the one that he was dying in that chair. If the griffin kills him, it will have yet saved his life. And I heard the door close. I asked Molly, speaking as low as I could, what did he mean about the king having died? But she put me to one side, and she went to King Lear, and she knelt in front of him, reaching up to take one of his hands between hers, and she said, Oh, Lord, Majesty, friend, dear friend, remember, oh, please, please, remember. The old man was swaying on his feet, but he put his other hand on Molly's head, and he mumbled, Child, Suze, is that your pretty name, Suze? Of course, I will come to your village. The griffin was never hatched that dares harm King Lear's people. And he sat down hard in the chair again, but he held onto her hand tightly. He looked at her, with his blue eyes wide and his mouth trembling a little, and he said, But you must remind me, little one, when I lose myself, when I lose her, you must remind me that I am still searching, still waiting, that I have never forgotten her, never turned from all she taught me. I sit in this place. I sit because a king has to sit, you see. But in my mind, in my poor mind, I am always away with her. I didn't have any idea what he was talking about. I do now. He fell asleep again then, holding Molly's hand. She sat with him for a long time, resting her head on his knee. And Schmendrick went off to make sure Lysen was doing what she was supposed to do, getting everything ready for the king's departure. There was a lot of clattering and shouting already, enough so you'd have thought that a war was starting. But nobody came in to see King Lear or speak to him, wish him luck, or anything. It was almost as though he wasn't really there. Me? I tried to write a letter home, with pictures of the king and the castle. But I fell asleep like him, and I slept the rest of that day, and all night, too. I woke up in a bed that I couldn't remember getting into, with Schmendrick looking down at me saying, Up, child, on your feet. You started all this uproar. It is time for you to see it through. The king is coming to slay your griffin. I was out of bed before he'd finished speaking. I said, Now? Are we going right now? And Schmendrick shrugged his shoulders. By noon, anyway. if I can finally get Lysanne and the rest of them to understand that they are not coming. Lysanne wants to bring 50 men-at-arms and a dozen wagon loads of supplies and a regiment of runners to send messages back and forth, and every wretched physician in the kingdom. He sighed and spread his hands. I may have to turn the lot of them to stone if we are to be off today. I thought he was probably joking, but I already knew that you couldn't be sure with Schmendrick. He said, if Lear comes with a train of followers, there will be no Lear. Do you understand me, Suze? And I shook my head. Schmendrick said, it is my fault. If I had made sure to visit here more often, there were things I could have done to restore the Lear that Molly and I once knew. My fault, my thoughtlessness. I remembered Molly telling me Schmendrick has trouble with time, and I still didn't know what she meant, nor this either. I said, well, it's just the way old people get. We have old men in our village who talk just like him. And one woman, too, Mem Jennett. She always cries when it rains. Schmendrick clenched his fist and pounded it against his leg. King Lear is not mad, girl, nor is he senile, as Lysanne called him. He is Lear. Lear still, I promise you that. It is only here, in this castle, surrounded by good, loyal people who love him, who will love him to death if they are allowed, that he sinks into the condition you have seen. He didn't say anything more for a moment, and he stooped a little to peer closely at me. Did you notice the change in him when I spoke of unicorns? Unicorn, I answered. One unicorn who loved him. I noticed. Schmendrick kept looking at me in a new way, as though we'd never met before. He said, your pardon, Suze. I keep taking you for a child. Yes, one unicorn. He has not seen her since he became king. But he is what he is because of her. And when I speak that word, when Molly or I say her name, which I have not done yet, then he is recalled to himself. He paused for a moment, and then added very softly, as we had so often to do for her so long ago. I didn't know unicorns had names, I said. I didn't know they ever loved people. They don't. Only this one. And he turned and walked away swiftly, saying over his shoulder, her name was Amalthea. Go and find Molly. She'll see you fed. The room I'd slept in wasn't big. Not for something like in a castle. Catania, the head woman of our village, has a bedroom nearly as large, which I know because I play with her daughter Sophia. But the sheets I'd been under were embroidered with a crown, and engraved on the headboard was a picture of the blue banner with the white unicorn. I had slept the night in King Lear's own bed, while he dozed in an old wooden chair. I didn't want to have breakfast with Molly, but ran straight to the little room where I had seen the king, and he was there, but so changed that I froze in the doorway trying to get my breath. 3 men were bustling around him like tailors, dressing him in his armor, all the padding underneath first, and then the different pieces for the arms and the legs and the shoulders. I don't know any of the names. The men hadn't put the helmet on him, so his head stuck out at the top, white-haired and big-nosed and blue-eyed. But he didn't look silly like that. He looked like a giant. When he saw me, he smiled, and it was a warm, happy smile, but it was a little frightening, too, almost a little terrible, like the time I saw the griffin burning in the black sky. It was a hero's smile. I had never seen one before. He called to me, "Little one, come and buckle on my sword if you would. It would be an honor for me." The men had to show me how you do it. The sword belt, all by itself, was so heavy it kept slipping through my fingers, and I did need help with the buckle. But I put the sword into the sheath alone, although I needed both hands to lift it. And when it slid home, it made it sound like a great door slamming shut. King Lear touched my face with one of his cold iron gloves and said, "Thank you, little one. The next time that blade is drawn, it will be to free your village. You have my word." Schmendrick came in then, took one look, and just shook his head. He said, "This is the most ridiculous. It is 4 days' ride, perhaps 5, with the weather turning. hot enough to boil a lobster on an iceberg. There is no need for armor until he faces the griffin. You could see how stupid he felt they all were, but King Lear smiled at him the same way he'd smiled at me, and Schmendrick stopped talking. King Lear said, "Old friend, I go forth as I mean to return. It is my way." And Schmendrick looked like a little boy himself for a moment, and all he could say was, "Your business. Don't blame me, that's all. At least leave the helmet off." And he was about to turn away and stalk out of the room, but Molly came up behind him and said, "Oh, Majesty, Lear, how grand, how beautiful you are." She sounded the way my Aunt Zerelda sounds when she's carrying on about my brother Wilfred. He could mess his pants and jump in a hog pen, and Aunt Zerelda would still think he was the best, smartest boy in the whole world. But Molly was different. She brushed those tailors, or whatever they were, straight aside, and she stood on tiptoe to smooth King Lear's white hair, and I heard her whisper, "I wish she could see you." King Lear looked at her for a long time without saying anything. Schmendrick stood there, off to the side, and he didn't say anything either. But they were together, the three of them. I wish that Felicitas and I could have been together like that when we got old. Could have had time. And then King Lear looked at me, and he said, "The child is waiting." And that's how we set off for home. The king, Schmendrick, Molly, and me. To the last minute, poor old Lysanne kept trying to get King Lear to take some knights, or soldiers, with him. She actually followed us on foot when we left, calling, "Highness, Majesty, if you'll have none else, take me, take me." And at that the king stopped and turned and went back to her. And he got down off his horse, and he embraced Lysanne, and I don't know what they said to each other. But Lysanne did not follow any more after that. I rode with the king most of the time, sitting up in front of him on his skittery